been a little while since we last saw you. And in that time, it seems like the world has had other plans for all of us lately. The global pandemic has pulled at every thread in the fabric of what we know to be normal life. It can be pretty goddamn stifling some days. But if we're fortunate enough to have the very things that this pandemic threatens, our health and our time on this planet, it really is crucial that we maximize the potential therein. There is zen in focusing on the things we cherish right now. We can find reacquainted purpose in those things. So get out and drive. Take time to reconnect with yourself in the driver's seat. Get lost in your garage and work yourself out of it when you're ready. Learn a new skill, start a new project. Sweep the floor of your shop. Hell, take a moment to exist in your own moment right now. New points of arrival are out there, and that's going to happen whether we like it or not. It's just up to us to determine how we show up to them. That being said, we're just happy to be seeing you here again, now. We're all doing the best we can. So with this safe social distance, let's start putting the pieces back together on our L-Series build. We got a lot of work cut out for us in this episode, so make yourself comfortable and join us. Welcome back to the Curb Cut. Okay, so you might notice since the last time you saw this deck that it's been cleaned and surfaced. I went ahead and did that by using one of these, a 3M Roll-Lock bristle brush. It's the perfect way to do this job. No more using razor blades, and don't even think of using Scotch-Brite. This is the way to do this job. All right, I also went ahead and painted the engine block. And when I did that, I left the old freeze plugs in place. I haven't replaced them yet. Because what we're gonna do now with cleaning out the water jackets is try and fill this thing up with Evapo-Rust to work into all the nooks and crannies. The less openings for that stuff to pour out while we clean this thing, the better. You know, some people might use acids and whatnot for this to get a thorough job, but the problem when you use acid on an engine block, especially a cast iron engine block, is that stuff works itself into the pores of the case. And ultimately, you're gonna have a really hard time cleaning that out. This stuff, water soluble, washes away, and again, is non-corrosive. The reason we decided to go this route with the Evapo-Rust is because when we inspected the block a little further, we decided that we didn't need to go ahead and actually hot tank the whole thing. The engine wasn't sitting for too long that any critical contact surface needed to be deep treated, and frankly, everything looks pretty decent. Honestly, with the economy the way it is right now, I could save a few bucks in the whole process and see it through myself. The decision kind of makes itself. All right, so we're letting this work its magic for a while, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna start knocking these freeze plugs out. A, to drain out what we poured in, and B, to power wash this thing once all the freeze plugs are removed. When you remove the freeze plugs, you want to aim at the inside edge of the plug with your hammer and spike. Trying to break these loose by hammering on the face of the plug will result in you busting right through them and cratering a hole in the inside of your water jacket. That would be bad. All you want to do here is knock them loose enough to pull them out with a set of pliers. They're going to seem stubborn, but don't overdo it. Consistent blows will free them up. Just take your time. Now that I have them all out, I'm going to use a little more Evapo-Rust and give the jackets one last rinse, in the interest of being thorough. Next step is power washing. We're gonna get all the loose debris out of the inside of this motor, everything that the Evapo-Rust shook loose. We're gonna get this thing thoroughly cleaned. Pressure washing an engine with water is argued about ad nauseum with guys on the internet. But the fact is this, washing with water is not inherently a bad move. It's letting the thing sit out and air dry on its own that creates problems. Blast this whole thing down as much as you can with your pressure washer. Don't be shy. When we're done, we're gonna use an air gun to really blow out all the water that's now hiding around the inside of this block. But this is only the beginning. Next, we're gonna take some WD-40 and spray the whole block down, everywhere, inside and out. Because remember, the WD stands for water displacement. We're gonna work the WD-40 into every corner of this block with compressed air again. Then, when it seems like things are looking dry, we're gonna do one more pass of the WD-40 to protect the block while it sits out in open air. new freeze plugs are going in next. We're gonna use some Permatex Forma gasket number 1. You don't have to use it. These things are meant to expand when they're inside the engine block. But again, adding a little bit is gonna make a nice seal around the edge. We don't know how uneven the edges are. If these things don't expand the right way, you're gonna end up with a little weep here and there, and it's just gonna be super annoying to have these consistent water leaks down the line. These things go in with a very tight fit. You'll find that a rubber mallet will absorb too much force and you'll swing forever with no results. And for those of you wondering, freeze plugs keep themselves closed when the engine runs through heat cycles. Their only real purpose is to provide an escape for water expansion if your coolant freezes. So if you're running 50-50 mixes, you're probably never gonna see these work, so to speak. But if you run only water as coolant, like perhaps you live in a typically hot climate, when the water freezes in the winter, it will push the plugs out before it runs the risk of cracking the block. All right, so we're gonna move away from the block for now and move on to our connecting rod and piston assemblies. The stock design uses a press-in wrist pin, whereas other designs use a floating pin. The difference there is that at the end of the wrist pin, there's little clips that hold a floating pin in, and that way the whole assembly moves around freely. With a press-in wrist pin, your wrist pin basically attaches to the connecting rod, and that becomes something of a rigid assembly once it's pressed in place. And then the piston itself moves freely on the outer edges. In order to move on from here and disassemble what we had originally with these dish pistons and original connecting rods, we're gonna have to move over next door and use a press to get these pins out. So again, these Datsun pistons utilize a press fit wrist pin. I've seen guys use extractor tools to get this job done with a sleeve and a tension bolt, but if you have the proper tools at your disposal or access to a press, the surest choice would be to do it that way. There's a lot of resistance in the binding between the pin and the Conrod, and if you're leveraging against a cast piston, which these happen to be, you run the catastrophic risk of having one crack or explode in you in the process. Now that we have the pins and pistons removed from these connecting rods, we have all of our pieces for the new rotating assembly out in front of us. It's time to get into balancing this motor. This starts with weighing every piece in sets, pistons with rings and pins, and the net weight of the conrods themselves. What I'm doing here is making 2 columns for the measurements, pistons and rods. Once those pieces are weighed down to the exact measurements in grams, you're going to orient the relationships of these parts where the lightest piston matches with the heaviest rod, and we can work up from there accordingly. Hopefully these differences only add up to a few grams. Out of the box, our piston weight should be pretty close to the weights of each other. And once you figured out the minimum set, you'll remove material with your drill or Dremel, or both, from the inside pin guides. The same sort of rule applies when removing material from our conrods. Here we're going to remove material from the underside of the casting marks on the crank bearing cap, and more specifically here from the highest edge, where rotation force and heat is impacted the least. Do not remove material unevenly from the arms or short end pin area if you can avoid it. So how precise is this process really? Well, admittedly, this is not the most precise blueprinting you can do. Frankly, this might be the crudest approach you can take while still working for a safe outcome. The reason this can be done as such is for two reasons. For one, rotating assemblies rarely ever come balanced from the factory within the tolerances we're looking for here. Secondly, when considering the function of a balanced motor, we're at an advantage here already. Being as that this L28 is an inline motor, crude balancing such as this nets some pretty decent results. If this were a V-shaped motor, for example, more precise blueprinting would be required to balance the rotating assembly. In a V8, for example, the weights of the assembly oppose each other to the outer vertical edges of the engine. And if those weights are off or drastically out of balance, well shit, you've got a real shaker on your hands. All right, so we gave this thing a pretty thorough cleaning as you saw earlier, but now as we move closer to reassembly, we're gonna have to really get in and do a more precise cleaning. And that's gonna involve some automatic transmission fluid and some lint-free rags. The ATF has a unique knack at trapping up all the loose contaminants that spray cleaners just tend to move around. It's a good thing to use when you're trying to clean off crucial contact surfaces like cylinder bores and bearing journals. Now that we cleaned the block of all the loose debris and grit that could have been left over from our original cleaning, I'm gonna take this time to go ahead and polish the crankshaft. Because while everything's disassembled, why not get in there and get a nice mirrored polish? Doing a decent polish of the crank is always a good move. And even if you're just using some quality metal polish you have around the garage, that'll net a pretty positive result. Basically what we're doing is making the contact surface between the Conrod bearing and the crank as smooth as possible. That way they rotate as efficiently as possible when oiled and operating. Marred or blemished crankshaft surfaces will continue to get worse as the engine works, so it's always best to correct or prevent this when you have the chance. Before we move on to putting our pistons on our connecting rods and getting this motor back together, we have to measure the end gap in our piston rings. And a great source of reference material for this is the old Hansowitz how-to book. So we have our piston rings, and we're gonna take them over to the block and size them up. We're gonna use our little feeler gauge here to see what our tolerances are and what our gap size is. And then, if we need to take any material off, we're gonna use this cool little tool here, little piston ring filer. And you're only shaving minuscule amounts off of these rings when you need to shave them. To get them to fit right, you put them in like so. You butt them up against these two centering screws right here, and very lightly remove material. Now, according to the Hansowitz How to Modify Bible, the end gap calculations for your two compression rings are as follows. Cylinder bore inches times 5/1000 for the top ring, and cylinder bore inches times 4/1000 for the second ring. The oil rings can be filed to the same specs as the second ring, but when installed, the top oil ring should line up with the top compression ring, and the lower line up with the second. Now, when you arrive at the raw math on what your gaps are supposed to be, I would suggest rounding up just a hair if you're running a higher compression motor. As you know, when the rings expand, the gap closes. If your gaps are too tight, they could run the risk of butting up and cracking, or even worse, they can produce enough pressure to crack the piston entirely. So check your math, and if you're not sure, size up a little if you know you're gonna be pushing the limits down the line. Now finally, it's time to connect our pistons to the rods. In order to attach the pistons to the Conrods, we're going to employ this old trick of heating up the rod end with a torch. Once it's blue hot, we're going to push the rod through the expanded clearance provided by the heat. Obviously, you're going to need some welding gloves for this one. Once you have this thing hot enough, you only have a few seconds to push the pin through before the rod snatches the pin and goes rigid on you. Make sure you're swift with this process and you have more than enough heat employed to make a clean pass. All right, so the moment we've all been waiting for, we're gonna get these flat tops in this block once and for all. It's important to note that when you line up your piston rings, you don't want them to be overlapping at all in the end gaps. That causes oil blow through and just a lot of oil consumption. Will be burning oil. It's a pain in the ass. So when you line these up for install, make sure they're in opposing directions. That way you don't have that issue. The old Conrod bearings were in great shape, so we know that our contact agreement with the crank is in order. However, we're still going to change them out. That way no minute imprints are brought over to the new assembly. Just a good step to take, especially when these bearings don't cost too much in the first place. Okay, so as far as getting these things installed in your block goes, you're not gonna have any luck getting these rings into the block without using one of these compression tools. And be warned, they're a bitch to handle. I found that leveraging against my leg to get the tensions in place does the trick. Also, make sure you lather these up with a ton of assembly lube. And even using motor oil falls short in producing the viscosity you're gonna need in order to get these to go in without issue. Make sure you've lined up your piston notches to face the front of the motor. Make sure all your conrods are facing in the same direction and tap them in with your mallet. Once they're in, tap them down to the crank, install your end caps, and you're all set. Today we're just gonna hand tighten these new ARP rod bolts because the next time we see you, we're gonna address all the specific torque sequences of assembling the long block when we get our head back from the machine shop. But until then, thanks for joining us.